Welcome back. We're ready to start the next session. My name is Kelly Swanson. I'm a professor in human nutrition and the director of nutritional sciences at the University of Illinois. I'm also co-chair of the IFIN's Scientific Leadership Council. The next session is focused on the IFIN's inaugural Emerging Leader Awards. And these awards are granted to early career investigators generating high quality research with translational impact to public health. They are identified as individuals with promise as leaders in food safety and nutrition research. The next two presentations will be delivered by our 2025 Emerging Leaders awardees. And to start, I am pleased to welcome Byron Chavez, an associate professor at the University of Nebraska. Sorry, it rolls off my tongue too quickly. I wish, yeah. University of Nebraska, I apologize. Dr. Chavez is a food scientist with expertise in food safety microbiology, product and process validations, and food safety management systems. So we welcome him to share some of his work. Welcome, Dr. Chavez.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. Like Kelly said, my name is Byron Chavez. I'm at the University of Nebraska. I did go to Illinois a couple of years ago to give seminar, but they did not offer me a job, so I'm still at Nebraska. With that, let's talk a little bit about food safety. We've been hearing a lot about nutrition, which is great. Oh, well, first, I did miss a couple of things here that I'm gonna bring up at the end. But for now, most of my funding comes from NIFA, from USDA NIFA. There are other funding sources that I'll mention at the end, and I am a consultant for Neogen Corporation. Okay, well, let's talk about decisions, right? Decisions. So who would have liked to sleep a little longer this morning? Just raise your hand. I see a lot of people, you know, you travel, you go through airports, and then the next day, a little longer. I did snooze my alarm a little bit this morning, but then that was it. Then I woke up and I had to make many more decisions. Now, a lot of the decisions that we take on a daily basis may not be particularly important for whether we're gonna get sick or things like that, but some of those could be. What if I decided to eat raw eggs every morning? What if I decided to have that burger a little more pink in the center? And yes, do not judge me, but I do love raw oysters. I'm looking at Don Schaffner from Rutgers University. He does not approve, but I do love raw oysters. But of course, you know, we have to make an assessment about the risk, and not everybody can make that assessment in the same way. Now that is, of course, as a consumer, but what if we worked in industry? What if we had to make decisions about whether I accept or reject a batch or a lot of product, whether the formulation that I'm using right now is actually capable of inhibiting microbial growth over shelf life? How can industry actually make food that is safe? And of course, I don't have the answer to the question, is my food safe, right? When we do food safety product assessments or food safety assessments, it's much more complicated than that. We also have to keep in mind that food safety is much more complicated than wash your hands or cook your chicken to 165 degrees, right? Of course, those are really important things about food safety, but food safety and the food supply in itself is so complicated that there are many moving pieces. Okay, I don't want to ruin charcuterie meat for you, but we will talk about processed meats here in a little bit. And I must say, pretty much all of the work that I do is meat and poultry related, so both raw and processed meats. We also do a lot of ready-to-eat food environments, but I will not be talking a lot about that aspect. So the real title of this presentation is Taking the Guesswork Out of Food Safety at the Intersection of Food Production and Public Health at a Global Space, using data-driven approaches to decision-making. This title was a little too long for the program, but certainly is the space where I work. Now, when I say global food supplies, let me give you an example. I just came back from Costa Rica. I'm originally from Costa Rica, but I was in Costa Rica the last 2 weeks. And I was working directly with industry, with the dairy industry, with the meat industry, on addressing listeria contamination problems in food environments. And ready-to-eat foods, right? And so whether it's Costa Rica, whether it's Chile, whether it's Ghana, where I recently went to also evaluate some aspects of food production, we live in a globalized food supply, and we all know that. So making decisions is increasingly more complicated. Now, if I ask you, what is a biological hazard reasonably likely to happen in raw chicken products, what would you say? Salmonella, right? So that's what I tell my students all the time. When in doubt, salmonella, right? There's very few instances where salmonella, it's the wrong answer, okay? Why? Because we find salmonella everywhere in all sorts of food commodities in a variety of different environments. So that's an easy one, and if you said or thought salmonella, then you are correct, right? So we know that salmonella is a huge burden, causes a huge burden of illness in the United States with 1.3 million domestic cases annually, a number of deaths, and that roughly 20% of the salmonellosis cases are associated with the consumption of contaminated chicken, right? So we know that chicken continues to be a vehicle for salmonella contamination and transmission, and there's many others. These vehicles and these sources have changed over time, right? And microbial ecology changes. Now we see a lot of outbreaks and recalls associated also with produce. We tend to still blame animal protein as a main source of contamination for foodborne illness, and it still continues to be, and that's why we care about risk mitigation. When we think about risk, I mentioned this more earlier, some of the decisions that we make are not particularly related to whether we're going to get sick or not. But some of the decisions that I made as a consumer or as a food manufacturer are related to that. And so we need to provide risk mitigation strategies. Okay, so when we think about risk mitigation, that basically means reducing the probability that somebody is going to get sick by consuming my product, right? And so we attach a food commodity to a product, right? So we have food pathogen combinations, and we also have product and process combinations. So whether my food it's raw, let's say raw chicken, or whether I have fully cooked frozen chicken nuggets, then the risks may be different just based on the way that food is produced. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do in my lab through an applied research perspective to answer some of the questions at the intersection of food production and public health, and how the value, hopefully I'm going to show you what is the value of applied research for protecting public health. So basically, in the poultry processing industry, peroxyacetic acid is the most common antimicrobial, and there's multiple reasons for that. But the reality is that when we are deciding what antimicrobial treatment to use in the food manufacturing industry, companies don't really have a lot of guidance, right? There's money, right? Whether it's cheaper, whether it affects the color of my product, whether it extends shelf life, whether it's environmentally friendly. There's a lot of things that have to be considered. Now, we wrote this review on peroxyacetic acid, comparing it to many other antimicrobials, because we needed to guide decisions in the food industry, in the poultry industry in this case, which is a review that has been very well received. Now, from doing this review, we of course start kind of thinking, what are the gaps in the literature? What are some of the things that from an experimental perspective and applied research we can address? And we saw through subsequent experiments that organic matter in post-chill tanks, which happens towards the end of processing, throughout processing, does not affect the efficacy of PAA, which is something that does happen with chlorine. And even though these questions may seem easy to answer, we obviously need the data to prove that that is the case. Now, we also confirmed that salmonella cross-contamination happens in tanks, right? And so we see that there is a decline in the prevalence of salmonella, but the number of illnesses continue to remain steady, which is an issue. And so we know that cross-contamination during processing happens, basically proving that one bad part, in this case, was chicken thighs, can contaminate many others, okay? And so these are the types of questions that we work directly with industry, that we address directly with industry. We mimic conditions that happen in industry. And keep in mind that when we do applied research, really is to mimic a situation that happens in industry. So we work with companies so that we can reflect what's actually happening in food processing. Now, another big question that the poultry industry had is related to what we used to call byproducts, right? So when we think about chicken, we think about chicken parts, chicken carcasses, but it turns out that things like chicken livers and hearts are very popular. And we used to send these to foreign markets. They used to go to the Middle East, they used to go to Mexico, they used to go to Southeast Asia, but now we use them quite a bit. And so we have to demonstrate that there is a way that we can keep those products safe by minimizing or reducing the risk associated with salmonella. And so we've done work around these type of products that don't only go to pet food, but it is more and more common to go to the supermarket and find these non-conventional poultry products that are in the supermarket. Now, I forgot to mention, I'm just going to go back one slide. I forgot to mention that a lot of this work was driven by my first PhD student, Carmen Cano, who's now a food scientist at Conagra Brands. And you will see pictures of my former and current graduate students as we go through the presentation. Now, while we know that peroxyacetic acid works and that industry chooses it for a reason, right? Whether it's cost or quality or whatnot, we are always looking for alternatives, right? We're always looking for alternatives, especially when the consumer wants less chemicals in their products, right? And so when we think about poultry in the United States, you may have heard recently there's a debate has been reopened on why is it that the European Union doesn't take American chicken, right? And so I can tell you all about it, but you can read also my piece on the BBC about that. I can send you the link. Okay, so we evaluated other alternatives, other treatments, right? So things like ozonated water. Does it work? Does it not work? It actually works for beef. So why is it that the chicken industry or the poultry industry is not using it? But it turns out that it doesn't particularly work to eliminate salmonella, right? So it might give us some other advantages, such as increasing the shelf life of the product, but it doesn't really kill the microbe of interest. And so from that perspective, we could not consider that intervention to be efficient. Now, it might work in other types of commodities, like I said, with beef, and maybe even with produce, but it's not something that we would recommend for poultry processing. Now, you guys can start seeing, right? There's a lot of value in replicating these things that happen in industry and then finding alternatives, because at the end of the day, a lot of these alternatives that we're evaluating are driven by costs, right? Can we find something cheaper that will still keep the product safe? But they're also driven by consumer desire to have a cleaner food supply. Okay, now I've been telling you a little bit about how we manage risk from an industry perspective, but what happens at the interaction of policy and risk management, right? And I'll give you an example of the case of Brazil. I recently had a visiting scholar, Silvana, from Brazil, funded by the government of Brazil, and she came to my lab to assess whether Enterobacteriaceae, which is a big family of microbes and that we use as a microbiological indicator, many of you may be familiar with that family, if we can actually reduce Enterobacteriaceae in raw chicken that is at the levels, using the levels of antimicrobials that the Brazilian government allows, which is very low levels of antimicrobials. 200 ppms, it's what they will do for peroxyacetic acid. In the US, we typically use anywhere between 500 and 750 for our chicken, right? So we do expose our chicken to high levels of antimicrobials, and they do quantitatively reduce foodborne pathogens. And then the other one that they allow is chlorine at 5 ppms, which is basically what we drink in tap water, okay? So it's really not much. Now, what we found is that regulation, that it's really geared towards process control and guiding what happens in process control in poultry processing in Brazil, does not really effectively minimize salmonella, non-pathogenic Enterobacteriaceae bacteria, or Listeria innocua, which is a surrogate that we use kind of like for Listeria monocytogenes, which is a pathogen. Right, so we start seeing that a lot of this work has the capacity to inform things that actually happen in policy. Right, like I said, I just came back from Costa Rica, and as a Costa Rican, I haven't lived in Costa Rica for 17 years, so I'm already very detached of what happens from a regulatory perspective. But we have a rule that applies to all Central American countries. So our food regulations are integrated all over Central America. And there's not a lot of scientific basis for a lot of the regulations, and that's actually a big part of the problem when we go to other places, in this case, Central America, and assess how do they manage risk. A lot of the times they just manage what the regulation tells them to manage, and it may lack scientific justification. Okay, it's a good thing that we all ate chicken for lunch, and so let's move on. Okay, if I tell you chicken, if I tell you salmonella, you tell me chicken. But if I tell you Shiga toxin producing E. coli, what would you say? Okay, beef, I heard beef. What else would you say? Okay, leafy greens, yeah. Okay, leafy greens, you're missing a couple big ones. Come on. Okay, well, pork, we'll get there. We'll get to pork. Okay, sprouts, right? And then typically raw milk. So those are big for STIC, right? And we have seen a change in microbial ecology where now we see many more outbreaks and illness cases associated with leafy greens than with beef, which used to be the main carrier, the main vehicle. Okay, now for food safety risk management, right, when we work directly with industry, and of course I'm an academic, but I also do extension, so I spend a lot of time in food processing operations, which is really enriching for my research and my teaching and whatnot. But one of the main questions that we want to answer is, in this case, for example, are Shiga toxin producing E. coli bacteria a hazard reasonably likely to happen in pork? We know that it happens in beef, it happens in raw milk, it happens in sprouts, it happens in leafy greens. But can we actually find this in pork? Well, the reason why we have this question is because there was, a few years ago, there was some push by the USDA FSIS to start sampling carcasses and product for STIC in pork products. And so that was a study that they conducted. They found that it was a very small proportion of the pork that was contaminated, and so they discontinued that study. But basically, what we wanted to do to complement that was to assess risk, right? And so one of the first things that we wanted to do was assess the exposure, right? So we wrote this review paper with data from all over the world, and we found that pork and pork products may be naturally contaminated with STIC bacteria at really high levels, right? And so we are certainly exposed, depending on the region of the world where we are located. And this is work that was done by one of my former PhD students, Manuel Hack, who's now a risk assessment scientist at PepsiCo. And so we found that one of the zero groups that it's on the screen in red, O91, was a particularly common zero group, but we don't really hear a lot about it, right? We hear about O157, non-O157, and others, but keep that one, the O91, keep that in mind. Now, what we also wanted to do was just not to evaluate the prevalence, but when we're thinking about risk, we want to assess the hazard, right? So we wanted to characterize the hazard. And so we saw from the literature that a lot of the isolates, STIC isolates from pork, fall under categories 3 and 4 of risk that you have on the screens. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but that basically means that they carry a moderate to low level of risk based on virulence factors, right? And so this is part of the hazard characterization that we do for pathogens. The first one that you see, the SDX2A and the AGAGR, it's related to the European outbreak of 2011. Some of you may remember that first was attributed to Spanish cucumbers. It ended up being fenugreek seeds from Egypt that were contaminated. But anyway, we also wanted to assess from a hazard characterization was the potential of STIC to grow in pork. And we're comparing all of these to salmonella because we know that salmonella is a hazard reasonably likely to happen in pork products. And so these are some of the things that we do from a predictive microbiology perspective. We assess growth, we assess the conditions that affect growth, and then we determine growth kinetics, and then we start thinking, okay, what are the things that we can inform with this, right? Can we inform decisions about whether a microbe is going to outgrow based on temperature abuse and by how much? What kind of data can we provide risk assessors so that they can create their quantitative microbial risk assessment models or inform those models? Now, something really interesting that we've seen in the studies that we do, I'm not showing you all of the math because probably only 1 or 2 people here would be interested in the differential equations that we use for this. I don't understand that, but fortunately I have students that do understand math. And so maybe I shouldn't say that, but it's okay. It's on record now. Okay, so when we think about cleaning product, right, we want to have a product that has a low microbial background for shelf life purposes, right? We want that product to not have a lot of background microorganisms. But it turns out that those background microorganisms may have a protective effect when it comes to preventing pathogen growth in that food product, right? So there's also this balance and interaction that happens between shelf life and pathogen growth. And when we are disinfecting or sanitizing meat products and applying antimicrobials, whether in surfaces or as ingredients, we also need to be mindful that those background microbes that we're eliminating may have a protective effect over the pathogen growth, okay? Now, that's something that we want to explore more in my lab. I'm not going to go through all of these things, but when it comes to the hazard characterization, that basically informs models for application of food safety management systems, for validation, for cold chain deviations, right? And basically what this means is if I receive a batch or a lot, in this case of raw pork, can I accept that lot based on the temperature profile, right? And if we have mathematical models that can tell us, based on the temperature profile that this product was exposed to, these are the chances that Salmonella will outgrow. These are the chances that Estek bacteria will outgrow to a point that is unacceptable, or even the background microbiomes, right? And so our mathematical models describe all of those things. Now, I'm not going to show you, like I said, a lot of data, but here's just some examples of what the data looks like and the things that we can figure out based on these growth models that we do for predictions, including things like serogroup 091 that was in red before, right, that we find in retail pork shows significantly lower growth than other microbial groups. And so even though we do find it fairly prevalently in raw meats, or in raw pork in this case, we studied and we said, okay, of all of the Estek bacteria that we studied and compared, this one had the slowest growth. And so that is a good thing, right? And so that is how we start informing risk assessments. Now, other things that we do from a statistical perspective is to try and correlate primary kinetic factors, right? And so we have all of these descriptors of how microbes grow and characteristics. What can we use to actually inform risk assessment, right? And so we do these mathematical associations and determine things like minimum temperature for growth. And in this case, let's say Estek bacteria, we found that in pork, 5.2 degrees Celsius was the minimum temperature for growth, right? We don't typically think of Estek bacteria as cyclotrophic bacteria the way that we think about Listeria or Clostridium perfringens type P or Yersinia enterocolytica. Maybe only a few of you are understanding what I'm saying, but those microbes can grow in refrigeration, right? And so we care about them because they grow in refrigeration. We don't typically think of Estek as that. But we do have models that predict that growth can happen in refrigeration, and then we go on and validate those models. We're currently doing that with Salmonella in chicken. And I can tell you that at 8 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 48, Salmonella can grow very, very comfortably in chicken. Okay, let's switch gears here because I only have 5 minutes. Let's switch gears to processed meats. I told you, I promised I was not going to ruin charcuterie boards for you, but maybe I will. So let's think about cure meats, right? Cure meats, the ones that we add nitrites to. We use that nitrite to inhibit spore germination within limits of temperature abuse. And we also know that consumers want less chemicals. Consumers want clean label antimicrobials. It's a big trend. And so we've done a lot of these evaluations of what happens when we formulate food products without nitrites and with products that are going to replace nitrites. So this one particularly was cooked and cured turkey sausages. This work was done by my former student, Mohan Lee, who's now a PhD student at Virginia Tech. And so in this one, it's about formulation, right? So you go to the lab as a product developer, you want to play with pH and water activity of your food product, and you modify pH by adding sodium bicarbonate, and then your water activity, you can vary things, right, including sodium chloride. And so in this case, basically what happens is that, as expected, the higher the pH, the better it is for growth. The lower the water activity, the worse it is for growth, right? But these things need to be validated, especially because there are people that do want to produce these types of products without nitrites, right? So how do we prevent spore germination? Now, one of the things that comes out of this is that our typical cooling curves, if you don't know this, when you cook a meat product, when you go up in temperature, that it's called thermal lethality. When you come down, that it's called thermal stabilization. And so you have to stabilize the product so that you don't have spores basically germinating, and in the case of Clostridium botulinum, producing toxin, or in the case of Clostridium perfringens, multiplying and then making somebody sick. So we have to validate the way that we cool down cooked meat products. Now, lastly, this is work done by my current PhD student, Priya Biswas, and it's an industry project where we are evaluating nitrite removers, right? So this is complete elimination of nitrites, not even from celery powder or anything like that, but we are comparing it to celery powder because that is our positive control, or our control for the nitrite one. And so basically what we are seeing in this case is that these antimicrobials, which are mostly polyphenols, I can't disclose the composition right now, but these are mostly polyphenols, do have an antimicrobial effect, okay? But they only work when we are cooling the product for 6.5 hours or for 8 hours, which is basically guidelines that we have from the USDA. Once we move to much bigger products, which we call large diameter, right? So think about products that are not like a hot dog, right? Those are easy to cool down, but if you have a product that it's much thicker and larger diameter, it's much harder to cool that down. So for the 15-hour, this type of products, these polyphenols that we are evaluating as nitrite replacers, do not effectively inhibit the outgrowth of Clostridium perfringens. So we couldn't, of course, make the recommendation to use those when you're formulating large diameter products. And so hopefully you've seen a little bit of the value of applied research, especially in food safety, but let me give you some idea. What are the things that we do? Well, we improve real-world decision-making, right? And hopefully by providing quantitative tools, we support regulatory compliance, like you just saw, for cooling down products, for lot acceptance also. We enhance risk assessment by better understanding how quantitatively microbes behave in foods. We drive continuous improvement and enable proactive identification of emerging hazards. Just to give an example, we're currently working with Helicobacter butzleri and Escherichia alberti as 2 emerging pathogens in poultry and comparing their growth to Salmonella and seeing what else. Keep in mind that 80% of the foodborne illnesses are never attributed to anything, to a pathogen or a food vehicle. With that, I am going to close. I want to thank my teams that you guys can see on screen, a lot of people that I work with that are absolutely phenomenal. My funding sources include the University of Nebraska, USDA NIFA, the Foreign Agricultural Service, the Foundation for Meat and Poultry Research and Education, and a couple companies, Preserve and Neogen. And these are the happy faces, hopefully. These are the faces of the people that are doing research to keep food safe. ChatGPT is not particularly good at creating word clouds, but that is a word cloud that was created with ChatGPT of students that are not in the picture or mentioned throughout the presentations. So with that, thank you very much. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to somebody. Oh yeah. Forgot about questions.
Hi, Nancy Ross and Monel. Nice presentation.
Thank you.
I just was curious, is there an opportunity for improvements in early detection of microbial contamination? Where throughout the process do you see the biggest gaps for technology to fill in?
Yeah, absolutely. So we continue to see a lot of issues with detection. A lot of the platforms have improved significantly. We see the enrichment portion, right? So lots of companies are still working on finding enrichments that can give you at least a potential positive response as early as possible. We have seen some improvements where we enrich for 8 hours, for example, and that's still within a shift, right? So you can still take samples, and then it doesn't take you a long time to release that product into commerce based on that response. But I would say that our limiting factor continues to be the enrichment. Now, it just depends for the type of sample, right? Whether it's food, whether the sample is raw meats or processed meats, because the level of contamination and interferences that you can have is different. Same if you're sampling surfaces and having sponges, right? So it depends, but I would go the short answer with the enrichment. Any other questions? You guys are letting me go very easily. I'm an academic, remember, I'm used to being on the receiving end of the questions. Okay, thank you.